Everyone likes to say, oh, I'll wait and do it in the off season. I'm sure you've heard many people say that. As meteorologists, we say that all the time. Whenever the weather quiets down, I'll do that thing or I'll take that vacation. But I think the biggest question is there an off season?
And this is going to be a great conversation because this actually came from a conversation I had with a customer. But before we get into all of that, I do want to say that if you haven't registered for the Raising Hail Tour, now is the time. So go get your ticket. We're going to be at 6 different cities across the US, and it'll be a great opportunity to prepare for this next storm season.
The Raising Hail Tour, we actually plan that in February, which we do consider a quieter season. So I guess the question, now that we are actually having this discussion, is do you think that we're going to get a big storm during one of our Raising Hail Tour events? Colin, just off the cuff, yes or no, what do you think?
Last year I was in Chicago and a storm rolled through on the day of the event. It actually grounded my plane. There was a tornado that almost hit the airport. So I had to spend the night that day. And it would end up being, I think, a 3-star event. So I think there's a good chance it could happen again.
So you can say, even from experience, we can still have storms in February.
Yes.
We like to say here in Oklahoma, tornado season is year-round, but we're not focusing on tornadoes today. We're actually focusing on hail. And at HailTrace, of course, that is our bread and butter, is to focus on those hailstorms. Hey, real quick, do us a favor, follow us, hit that follow button, and subscribe wherever you're watching this. Also follow us on Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, Threads, you name it. We've got a social media for it. We're even very active on LinkedIn.
So Taylor, this conversation that we're having today about is there an off season with hailstorms it originated from a conversation I had with a customer. Actually, 2 different people mentioned this to me, that they don't have an off season with their work in Oklahoma City. And it caught me off guard because there's a lot of talk in the restoration industry about there being off season and what do you do in an off season. And so this conversation, he kind of pointed to 2 things as being why he would say there was not an off season. One, he said that storms happen regularly in Oklahoma City, enough so that there's always work, especially in some of those months that are winding down in storms. And we're going to get to that. When are storms happening and when do they kind of slow down in those hailstorms? But then the other thing he pointed to was just being able to rework past storms and being able to be intentional about the areas that he is targeting. And a great resource if you guys want to explore more about how to work with your company in the off season. There's a podcast called Chasing Hail, There Is No Off Season.
People don't even know that the roof got hail when they were home. How many of those people do you think have no idea that their roof was hit with hail when they weren't home?
This is a podcast back from 2022. And Matt Grassmeyer, who is the director of Outward Sales, he actually explains really well some of the tips and tricks of how to work some of these off-season and how to rework some of these storms.
Keeping track of your existing client base and making sure that you're taking care of them by doing things like a client audit and saying, okay, we've got 100 clients. Let's see how many of them were impacted by hail this year. If we did 70 of those roofs, awesome. We're good. Let's go out and make sure, hey, we're coming by to just make sure everything is still okay with that roof that we put on, because we, stand behind our work and we do a good job. We just want to make sure that everything's okay.
I do highly recommend to go give that a listen.
Absolutely. I actually listened to a good portion of that podcast today, and it was very, very insightful for how roofers can still have business during what we would consider quieter season, or maybe your season in general has just been a little bit quieter than what you saw last year. There's a lot of great helpful tips on how HailTrace can help you and prepare you. But I think one of the questions that we need to answer about is there an off season is what about the on season? What about that really busy season? And here at HailTrace, we meteorologists know the busy season. A lot of people consider that, especially here in Oklahoma, March 15th through June 15th. But we actually looked at the numbers. We looked at it from the National Weather Service side, and we looked at it from HailTrace's side, and we really looked at what is considered the on-season or the busy season for different cities across the U.S. So really quick, we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but as a caveat here, we're going to be focusing on hail. Now, I know that high wind, tornadoes, hurricanes are definitely going to impact how busy you are throughout the year, but we're really going to be focusing on that bread and butter here at HailTrace, hailstorms. So let's get into the data here. The National Weather Service has actually provided us with a lot of data. And Colin, I'm going to show you a graph. What they have done here is they have plotted all of the storm reports. If you use HailTrace's product, you know about storm reports, and they look at the hail probabilities over 1 week throughout the year. So what you're looking at is the probability of hail falling in an area during a week at a time. They get these numbers by looking at those storm reports. A lot of those come from storm spotters that call them in, emergency managers that call in quarter-sized hail or ping pong ball-sized hail or even your massive softball-sized hail. So they plot that, and then they say, where should we see the largest hail? Where should we see any hail at all? There's some human bias here, of course, but I really like this map because it uses an estimate over a 30-year period, so there's a large data set here. Now, the first thing that I notice from this map is the likelihood for hail very obviously increases in early March, favoring southern states at first, but then slowly shifting to the north as the season progresses and we get into the summer months. I'm sure you can see that as those colors get darker farther up to the north as we get into those warmer months. Now, given this information, we could assume that the busy season for our southernmost state, let's say Texas, would be in the early spring and then quiet in the later spring. And then, of course, just the opposite for our northern states like Minnesota or North Dakota, that won't start to see an increase in a chance for hail until about late April, about a month and a half after Texas sees that increase. And then that continues into the middle of summer. Now, as we said earlier, we are going to really focus on hail stats here. If we were to look at high wind, tornadoes, hurricanes, we are going to see the season extended a little bit longer, but it also depends on, and Colin, I know that you're going to have this conversation in just a few minutes, but it depends on what area your company it covers. You know, that's going to also extend or shorten your storm season or your busy season as well. And I gave a few examples there. I gave that example of Texas. I gave that polar opposite example of Minnesota and North Dakota. But at HailTrace, we like to be specific and we like to go right down to the center of the map. We like to really zoom in. So we're actually going to talk about some specific cities. We've got Atlanta, Omaha, Oklahoma City, Dallas, and Denver. Not in that order, but Colin, let's get started.
So Taylor, do you want to jump in to Denver and kind of take a look at what storms happen? Does that kind of match what we're seeing with that prediction from the National Weather Service?
The National Weather Service estimated hail season for Denver, the most likely time of the year to get hail. That's going to be from late April to early August. Now, I looked at some of the biggest hailstorms that Denver has had over the last few years, and there's a ton of May storms, May 30th, 2024, May 10th, May 12th, 2023. We've got those May storms in here. We've got a lot of June storms as well. But one thing I noticed is that over the past 20, 30 years, we have seen every now and then a September or October storm. Okay, we don't have a ton of late season storms, but it definitely does happen. And I think that one that most people remember, especially if you're in Denver, is that September 29th, 2014 and 2015 storm, okay? There were 2 years that we had a big hailstorm on the same day, September 29th, 2014, and then the following year, September 29th once again. And that's a very, very late season storm for Denver. So Yes. Do most of your storms happen between that late April and early August time period? Absolutely. Can you get storms outside of that time period? Absolutely. Okay, let's go a little bit farther to the south now, down to the plains and into Oklahoma City. Colin, Oklahoma City, the storm season is early March to late July, but you kind of looked at the stats. Is that what we usually see here in Oklahoma City?
Yeah, so Oklahoma City, obviously, this is where a lot of our customers are at HailTrace and where HailTrace is kind of based out of. And so we're going to see here in March through July coincides pretty well with what we're going to see with the National Weather Service predictions are. But there are quite a few outliers when you look at the last several years. For example, last year in 2024, we had that September 24th storm. That was a really big storm that hit right through Oklahoma City, was kind of late in the season to have a storm like that. We also saw that the year before in 2023, there was a September storm that hit like 4,000 different addresses. And it was, again, another big storm. And we see these outliers happen through September, October. There's been several storms through the years that will get pretty large hail. But once you get past November, we get into December, January, February, there's very few outliers that kind of happen in Oklahoma City. There was one in February and a few years back in February 2023, but that was a little bit of a smaller hailstorm. So you will see some of those storms happen, but generally, once you get past October, so November through February, there's very few hailstorms.
So it's possible. It can happen. We always say in Oklahoma that storm season could be year round. We saw tornadoes at the very end of December and early January before, but those hailstorms are going to be more likely to happen during that severe weather. There's those spring months, and then as late as October is what you found, November.
Yes, yeah. There's definitely some different storms, and you can point to, oh yeah, I remember that storm in November. I remember that storm in February, but they're much fewer, and you won't see them as often.
In the winter months. And there's some meteorological data and reasoning to really back that up. It's a lot colder. It's going to be harder to get that really good moisture in here that we need to create that hail with those storms. Okay, now Dallas is not too far away, so take us farther down to the south. What about the storm season in Dallas?
You know, when I was looking at these different cities, I thought Dallas and Oklahoma City would be nearly identical, but it does show in Dallas that they do get more storms in what you would consider more off-season. So Dallas, Fort Worth, they have their storm season between March and early July, but you'll again see storms in September. Again, September 24th, 2024, there was a storm. The year prior, also on September 24th. So that was 2 years in a row on the same day. There was a pretty big hailstorm in Dallas. But then when you start looking at October, November, December, even January, you'll see some of these storms happening once in a while. A great example of this is in January, on January 11th, there was a smaller hailstorms that hit January 4 in December. There was several storms that have hit in 2022 and 2021. So you will start seeing some of these storms that happen in those months that Oklahoma City, you don't really see in December or January. So that was a really interesting find.
You know, I found a very similar thing to that in Atlanta. So maybe it's these southern states. There's something about that moisture coming up from the Gulf. I'm not quite sure, but I found something very similar in Atlanta where we got some really, really early season storms where we talked about in Denver and in Oklahoma City. We saw those late season storms be the outliers. But in places like Atlanta, I saw some of these early season storms. So in Atlanta, if you go back to that map that we showed you earlier, you're going to see an uptick in hail chances from early March to the middle of July. And of course, I saw a ton of April storms, April 24th, 2021, April 18th, 2017. We saw a ton of May storms as well and March, but I saw a lot more early season storms than what I saw in places like Denver. So February 28th, that was the day that we had high wind and some small hail. It was mainly a wind event, but we also saw some hail with this. We also saw a January 2nd storm and even a December 9th and December 10th back 2004, there was a severe weather event on those days as well. So I saw some early season storms that I didn't necessarily see in places like Denver or that we've heard about in Oklahoma City, which I thought was really interesting because that means that the busy season was extended earlier on in the year versus later in the year, which is what we've seen at some of these other cities. Now let's go to the other side of the country, up to Omaha, the Northern Plains. We really haven't talked about the Northern Plains too much here. Colin, I know you looked into Omaha here. What did you find up there?
So Omaha, their storm season's going to fall early April and going through August. And what you tend to find is the storms that happen fall in that time frame on most of them. There are a few outliers. For example, October 30th of 2024, October 11th of 2022 are both great examples of some storms that hit Omaha outside of that storm season. But those are smaller hailstorms. Those are like inch hail that fell in those areas. And then there was also a December storm back in December 15th, 2021. That was a little bit of hail that hit. But besides those, in the last 4 to 5 years, you don't really see many hailstorms that happen outside of that April to August window. So that was definitely a change compared to some of those other cities like Dallas or Oklahoma City and what you saw there in Atlanta.
Okay, so that was our last city that we researched. Do you have any final thoughts here about what we've seen from these cities? I've seen that most of your hailstorms are going to happen during what we consider the busy season, during your spring months. But of course, you can't ever rule out a rogue storm to happen in November, in September, maybe even in December. Maybe if you're out in Atlanta, even earlier in the season, like January or February. You know, it's possible. But most of those storms are going to happen during those spring months.
Yeah, and it is interesting here. So kind of connecting the storm season as far as when storms happen, what we were just talking about here, and kind of connecting it to the restoration industry and being able to work during this off season. The one thing I do want to point out here, Taylor, is this idea from a book called Crossing the Chasm by Jeffrey A. Moore. And what is really fascinating about his book, I actually have this picture here that we can throw up on the screen. So what's really interesting is he describes when you have new technology, the adoption cycle and the sell cycle is going to change with different groups of people. You're going to have the innovators and the early adopters being the first people to jump in and utilize a new tool. And then you have to kind of cross this big gap, what he calls a chasm, to get to the early majority, the late majority. And then there's a small percentage of people called the laggers that will rarely or ever use a new technology. How this connects to the roofing industry is something that Matt Van Every pointed out to me. He's our product manager, and he's been in the roofing industry for a decade plus. And one of the things is when you're selling these roofs and when you are working these storms, there's going to be the people that jump in and get their roof replaced right away. Then there's going to be those people who, once they see their neighbors getting their roof replaced, then they also want to get a new roof. And then eventually there's going to be those laggers who may never get their roof replaced or get it replaced much, much later than the rest of the neighborhood. And knowing that and understanding that can really help you know, oh, hey, even if there are no storms for several months and there's this off season, going back and reworking neighborhoods, reworking storms can really bring some new opportunities and can really connect and find these honey holes, find places that people have damage on the roof and still just haven't been found yet.
So for me, I'm not a roofer, right? But what I understand from that is that you may be working some of those houses in the pink and the orange color right after the storm, right after that late season storm. You've got tons of work through September, through October, but it may take a while to get the blue and the purple houses for those homeowners to contact you. That's what you're working in December and in January. And that's really where HailTrace comes in handy, because you can see where have people not had their roof replaced in a really long time. And those are going to be your blue and your purples that you're going to work in the off season, or what we would consider the off season. And as we've determined here, it's different for everyone. But did I get that right, Colin? That example?
Yes, yeah, you did. So in those early majority, late majority, and laggers, those are going to be opportunities to go back and rework these areas, which is also why having hail maps to kind of reference to when these storms happen, what areas haven't been worked or need to be worked again, can be really vital in your process.
Well, this was a great conversation. Is there an off season? And as meteorologists, we love to talk about the off season whenever it gets quiet. Yes, I said the Q word. We don't like to say the Q word too much around here because that means something's going to happen. Something always happens after you say the Q word is what we like to call it. But is there an off season? This was a great conversation about that. If anyone who's listening today has any comments about when their off season is, do you even get an off season? Send us a DM. And if you have any topic suggestions for our podcast, send us a DM as well. We can be found on all social media platforms under HailTrace. You name it, we are probably on it for social media.
And Taylor, it was a great conversation. What we're trying to do is bridge the gap between the restoration industry and weather. We'll see you guys in another 2 weeks.